Each week, we tell the stories and cover the cases of those on death row. But we don't often hear about the women facing the death penalty. So tonight, we're covering the story of Erica Sheppard. Sheppard is a survivor of child abuse, domestic violence, and rape. She spent the last 26 years on death row after being found guilty of murder and sentenced to death in 1995. During the trial, the defense spent less than 2 hours defending her case. The jury was never told about her long history as a victim of sexual assault and domestic violence. Here to discuss more about this case is Chelsea Halstead, the Associate Director for the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide. Chelsea, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Yodit. Really happy to be here.
Erica has spent close to half her life living on death row. Can you bring viewers up to speed by briefly walking us through the facts of her case?
Absolutely. So Erica Sheppard is a mentally, physically disabled survivor of domestic violence, child abuse, multiple rapes, and she was sentenced to death in a trial that completely disregarded that history, and for an act that she was only an accessory to. So she was not the person who dealt the fatal blow that resulted in the death of the victim. And what we know is now, looking back, is that racism really tainted her entire trial. The prosecution struck any Black jurors from serving on her jury. And as you mentioned in the intro, they spent about 70 minutes defending her. So it really was the perfect storm of institutional racism and then a complete disregard for what this woman had been through that led her to be where she was when the crime was committed.
Now, Erica had an extremely traumatic childhood, and at the time of her arrest was suffering from acute mental illness. And you mentioned during her trial, her lawyer failed to present even a shred of evidence about the sexual violence she endured and her struggles with mental illness. For those who might ask what any of that has to do with the crime of murder, explain why it does and why this was a missed opportunity.
Well, so what this really gets down to, Yodi, is state responsibility. What we saw is that the state failed over and over and over again to protect Erica when she was a victim. She went to the police multiple times, both for rapes that she suffered and for the domestic violence she suffered at the hands of both her caretakers and her partners throughout her life. And continually, we see that the state failed to protect her. However, when she became involved in a crime, suddenly the state stepped up to make her a perpetrator. And so that's what we're really combating at the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide, is that refusal to recognize that intersectional discrimination is real, and women like Erica Sheppard really suffer more than anyone else in this system. So, you know, you mentioned she suffered childhood sexual trauma. She also suffered gang rape. And at the time when the crime was committed, she had just been expelled from a women's shelter. So she really was, you know, seeking help and not receiving it when she needed it. And that's what led to the conditions that made her, you know, participate in the crime. She was also only 19 years old at the time. She had brain damage, and to this day, she continues to have you know, intellectual disabilities as well as physical disabilities. And the reason that this matters is that trauma really plays a role in how, particularly how women react to police interrogations. What we've seen and what our research has shown is that women who have had experiences with trauma tend to react in a way that might be perceived as acquiescent to authority figures when they're in a situation where they're being interrogated. This can lead to false confessions. This can lead to them not presenting in the way that you might typically think they would present following a traumatic event. So there's another woman we're representing right now on death row who you know, was coerced into giving a confession about the death of her daughter. This is Melissa Lucio in Texas. And you know, she gave this confession after hours and hours of interrogation. and just acquiesced that I guess I did it. And that's what we see
Yeah.
with trauma survivors, is that they really they're not able to cope with the demands of interrogations when they're put under that pressure by police.
Now, Erica, a black woman, she was found guilty by a mostly white jury. You mentioned before that race played a role in her conviction and sentencing, or at least in her conviction. The prosecutors struck all black jurors. How else did race play a role?
So it really played a role in the way that the prosecution spoke about Erica. And that's something that we're also really working to combat at the center is, arming defense attorneys with the tools they need to really object when prosecutors come in and are using this racialized language. Erica was referred to as a jackal. She was referred to as a predator. She was defeminized. She was adultified. These are all things that happen to black women when they're caught up in the criminal legal system. They're not the same realities that we see when white women are convicted of similar crimes. And
Absolutely.
Tomorrow we have a launch of a gender best practices manual where what we're really trying to do is arm defense attorneys with the competencies they need to understand how to defend people in this situation. So if you're going to be encountering intersectional discrimination, you need to have intersectional advocacy in order to really advocate for your clients. And that's what we're trying to do.
That's really important, and that's what's missing in our continuing legal education. When you're appointed to a case, what the courts normally look at is if you've met the certain requirements in terms of how many trials you've had with regards to a murder or an assault or whatever, and how many hours of continuing legal education, but they don't actually have the training that you speak of that is so critical in these types of cases. Chelsea, during closing arguments, the prosecutor also used negative gender stereotypes to attack Erica, saying that she may be a woman, but she's certainly no lady. What was the prosecution strategy there, and how often are these trial tactics used, especially against women of color?
I'm so glad you asked that, and this is a major focus for us. The reason that they say those things is that, as I mentioned before, it defeminizes the person who's on trial. And by defeminizing them, we strip them of any sympathy or any relatability they might normally have as a woman. We make them into the other when we use that type of language, when prosecutors do. And so what we saw in Erica's case is that that kind of language allowed the jury to understand her as aggressive and kind of outside of the normal gender roles that we expect women to adhere to. And so what we're trying to do at the center is to understand that, women on death row might be a minority, but almost every single woman that we come across, that we represent, has faced this kind of intersectional discrimination. Women of color in particular, they face being perceived as older than they are. They face sexism, racism, and what we're hoping is that, although they are a minority of the folks who are on death row, that by illuminating their cases, what we can do is win victories for the entire criminal justice system. So, we advocate for those who are really the most marginalized within that system with the intention of creating benefits that will be felt by everyone within that system.
Chelsea, men make up the overwhelming majority of those sentenced to death, but describe the hardships that are particular to women who live on death row.
What we see in our work is that every single woman whose case we've taken on, who's on death row, is the survivor of gender-based violence. Most have severe mental illness. Many have been raped. And many have a host of adverse childhood experiences. And what we also see is that the state has continually failed to protect these women when they needed it. And in that failure, what they've done is essentially create the conditions that lead to these women committing the crimes that they do. Often these are crimes against members of their family, crimes committed out of desperation, crimes that are a result of the poverty that they experience. And so our attempts to illuminate these women's stories is really to show that these women were victims long before they were perpetrators.
Now, you mentioned that that the center is going to be hosting a virtual discussion about the importance of gender-sensitive legal representation, and y'all are going to be featuring 2 different women who spent time living on death row before being exonerated. What can you tell us about those two women?
Yeah, we're really excited. This is going to be tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And, you know, something that we're really committed to at the center is crowdsourcing all of the knowledge that we produce. So this manual will be available for free to download from our website, and we really just want to get it in as many hands as possible. It includes a gender-sensitive questionnaire that will really lead attorneys through how to chat with their female clients and also gender nonconforming clients. We made a very conscious effort to include trans women in this manual because there are trans women on death row. They're a minority and they're invisible, but they exist. And in terms of the folks who are going to be joining us on that panel tomorrow, we have Sabrina Butler and Deborah Milkey. They're both survivors of death row. They were exonerated. They were the first and second women to be exonerated from death row. Both of them were initially sentenced to death for crimes or for the perception that they had killed their children. They were both later exonerated, so we know that that wasn't the case. But you know, their cases are really emblematic of the kinds of crimes that women get sentenced to death for. You know, when the death of a child is involved, we see that women are more often likely to receive these really extreme sentences. So we'll be really happy for anyone to join tomorrow to kind of learn how you can use the skills that we've you know, captured in this manual to better protect women facing extreme sentences. Such an important event tomorrow that I would be urging many of the legal community, especially mine here in Dallas, to attend virtually. Thank you so very much, Chelsea Halstead, Associate Director for the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide. Thank you again for your insight.